I got home from my church's Easter celebration in New York, only to find out that Pakistani Christians who were celebrating Jesus' resurrection had a very different experience. The Taliban not only targeted Christians on Easter Sunday, they targeted Christian women and children on Easter Sunday. As of this recording, 67 victims, mostly women and children, have died, but that number is expected to rise since there are more than 300 injured. Christians make up less than 2% of the population of Pakistan, and they are subject to vicious persecution and even suicide bombings, as we saw earlier today. But instead of trying to understand the source of this persecution, our leaders will focus on convincing us that it has nothing to do with Islam. The ivory towers of Western politicians and the studios of various news networks are filled with self-assured experts on the topic of Islam, experts who, oddly enough, have never read any of the Muslim sources. And because they've never read any of the Muslim sources, they have to base their views of Islam on things they've heard or their experiences with their Muslim friends or the scripts that are handed to them. Not surprisingly, when politicians and reporters are confronted with what the Muslim sources actually say about jihad, they have to fall back on some freakishly bad responses in order to keep reality from penetrating those hard shells that surround their oyster-like brains. The most common response I hear from Westerners who rush to defend Islam after every terrorist attack carried out in the name of Islam goes something like this. Islam can't possibly promote terrorism because I know lots of peaceful Muslims who condemn terrorism. Obviously, if Islam promoted terrorist attacks, all Muslims would be waging terrorist attacks. But most Muslims aren't waging terrorist attacks. Therefore, terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. So Allah's repeated commands to wage jihad and to terrorize the enemies of Islam can't mean what they say, because if they did, all Muslims would wage jihad. This response was forged in the fires of Mount Stupid. Think about this. Can you legitimately say, many Muslims don't do X, Y, or Z, therefore Islam doesn't teach X, Y, or Z? No, Islam is defined by the Quran and the Hadith, not by our Muslim friends. Our Muslim friends are not, have never been, and never will be authoritative sources of Islamic doctrine and practice. Even if every Muslim in the world decided not to pray, this would have absolutely nothing to do with whether Islam commands them to pray. So the entire method of investigation used by Islam's Western defenders is absurd. But it's absurd for another reason, namely that if they tried to use this kind of response in any other area, even they would immediately spot the blunder. If they applied their Islam can't cause terrorism because I know lots of Muslims who don't support terrorism reasoning in any other situation, they'd be laughed out of the room. Let me give you an example of how the same reasoning could be used to refute the claim that anything is harmful. This is a pack of cigarettes. On the side of the pack is a stern warning from the Surgeon General of the United States. Surgeon General's warning: smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking causes lung cancer, Mr. Surgeon General. Well, for your information, I happen to know many smokers, and not one of them has lung cancer. Therefore, smoking can't possibly cause lung cancer, because surely if smoking caused lung cancer, all smokers would have lung cancer, just as if Islam caused violence, all Muslims would be violent, right? Not right. When the Surgeon General says that smoking causes lung cancer, he doesn't mean that if you smoke, you'll definitely get lung cancer, or even that you'll probably get lung cancer. You probably won't. This warning simply means that due to the effects of smoking, your chances of getting lung cancer increase significantly if you smoke. That's all it means. So the question we should be asking about Islam is not, are all Muslims violent? We should be asking whether belief in Islam significantly increases your chances of supporting terrorism or suicide bombings or the persecution of religious minorities. And the answer to this question should be obvious. Why do we see Muslims from completely different countries, from completely different ethnic and social backgrounds coming to the same conclusions about jihad? How do Muslims in Nigeria and Muslims in Iraq and Muslims in Afghanistan and Muslims in Pakistan get such similar ideas about how they should treat Christians? These Muslims speak different languages, they eat different foods. What's the common thread? Why do we hear so much about suicide bombers in all these countries? Muslims from around the world have traveled to the Middle East to join ISIS. Why would there be Muslims from the United States and Canada and Great Britain and France who agree with the goals and methods of ISIS? We can even be mathematically precise when we say that support for terror is significantly higher among Muslims than among non-Muslims, because we have statistics that show what Muslims from various countries believe. According to a 2004 poll, 65% of Muslims in Pakistan, 55% of Muslims in Jordan, and 45% of Muslims in Morocco had a favorable view of Osama bin Laden. A 2011 poll showed that 44% of Pakistani Muslims viewed Osama bin Laden as a martyr. In 2010, 34% of Muslims in Jordan, 49% of Muslims in Nigeria, 23% of Muslims in Indonesia, and 20% of Muslims in Egypt had a favorable view of Al-Qaeda. In 2004, 31% of Muslims in Turkey said that suicide attacks against Americans and other Westerners in Iraq are justifiable. In 2009, nearly 1 in 4 British Muslims said that the 7/7 bombings were justified. A 2005 study found that 18% of British Muslim students would not inform police if a fellow Muslim were planning a terrorist attack. A Pew study that came out just a few months ago showed that 20% of Muslims in Nigeria and 12% of Muslims in Malaysia have a favorable view of ISIS. The same study showed that only 28% of people in Pakistan were willing to say that they have an unfavorable view of ISIS. Only 28% of Pakistanis have an unfavorable view of ISIS. So yes, you're dealing with a minority of Muslims who support terrorist attacks, but the numbers are nevertheless much higher than they are among non-Muslims. Since the only plausible explanation for the difference here is the vast array of commands in the Muslim sources to violently subjugate non-Muslims, until someone comes up with a better explanation, we can say, without hesitation, warning, this book causes terrorist attacks. Warning, this book causes suicide bombings. Warning, this book causes the persecution of religious minorities. Warning, this book causes ISIS-style theocracies. But David, I have Muslim friends who don't support terrorism. Yes, and I have smoker friends who don't have cancer. What does this have to do with whether Islam and smoking increase the risk of extremism and the risk of cancer? If you're going to call people Islamophobes for drawing attention to the impact Islam has on societies, you might as well call the Surgeon General of the United States a Marlboro-phobe, because he uses the same methods in arriving at his conclusions about smoking that many people use in arriving at their conclusions about Islam.